Thomas Miller froze mid-stride, his weathered hand clutching the barbed wire fence as his breath caught in his throat. The desperate growl wasn't what stopped him. It was the eyes. The bear's amber gaze held no aggression, only a mother's raw desperation. Martha's coffee cup shattered against the porch steps when she saw what he was dragging home. A massive black bear, leg mangled in a steel trap, 3 tiny cubs, mewling pathetically against her blood-matted fur. "Tom, for God's sake," she whispered, instinctively reaching for the phone before letting her hand fall. Last spring they'd found a fawn with a broken leg. Fish and Wildlife had euthanized it on the spot. "Don't call anyone," Thomas commanded, his voice steadier than his trembling hands. How could he explain that saving this bear wasn't just kindness? It was his last chance at redemption for a 30-year-old sin written in blood and empty whiskey bottles. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The floorboards of Thomas Miller's front porch had long ago memorized the cadence of his morning ritual. 72 years had etched deep lines into his face, matching the worn paths his boots had traced across the wooden slats each dawn for 3 decades. The home itself, a modest 2-bedroom craftsman at the edge of Oakwood Forest, had witnessed both the happiest and most desolate chapters of his life. 5 years ago, Sarah Miller had taken her final breath in their bedroom after 47 years of marriage. Cancer had claimed her body, but Thomas felt it had taken far more than that. It had stolen his purpose, his compass, his reason to greet each day with anything more than resignation. Every morning since, Thomas maintained their shared rituals with the devotion of a monk. He would rise at 5:30 a.m., brew coffee for 2, and place Sarah's blue ceramic mug across from him at the kitchen table. Beside it, her photograph in a hand-carved maple frame smiled at him, eternally 65, her silver-streaked hair caught by the wind at Lake Superior just 6 months before the diagnosis. "Morning's looking fair, Sarah," he'd say, his voice rough from disuse. "Woodpeckers are back in the old oak. Remember how they used to wake us on Sundays?" The silence that followed had become as much a part of his life as breathing. His children had their own lives now. Emily, a cardiothoracic surgeon in Minneapolis, called dutifully once a month. The conversations rarely lasted more than 5 minutes. Jason ran some kind of tech company in Seattle. Thomas had never quite understood what his son did for a living. Their children, Thomas's grandchildren, were strangers whose growth he tracked through Christmas card photos. Martha Wilson, his neighbor of 27 years, was the only person who regularly penetrated his solitude. Widowed herself 3 years ago, she brought casseroles he didn't ask for and conversation he claimed not to want. Yet her Tuesday and Thursday visits had become silent fixtures in his weekly calendar. What no one in Oakwood knew, not Emily with her medical degree or Jason with his business acumen, was that Thomas's isolation wasn't just grief. It was penance. For 30 years he had carried a secret heavier than all the lumber he'd ever cut in his carpentry days. A mistake made in a moment of drunken irresponsibility that had cost 3 lives and orphaned a small boy. The kind of mistake no amount of time or good deeds could erase. Sarah had known. She had forgiven him, helped him get sober, kept his secret. But without her steadying presence, the weight of it had begun to crush him anew. The whiskey bottles called from the store shelves each time he went to town. So far he had resisted. 5 years sober after Sarah's death, 25 years sober before that. But sobriety didn't equal redemption. Nothing did. Not the anonymous checks he'd sent for years to support the orphaned boy's education, not the volunteer work at the hospital, not even Sarah's unwavering love. Thomas Miller was a man waiting to die with his sin still heavy on his soul. The morning that changed everything began like any other. Thomas pulled on his worn flannel shirt, laced up his hiking boots, and set out along the familiar trail that wound through Oakwood Forest. The path had been there long before Thomas built his house, probably carved by deer and early settlers. Now it served as his daily pilgrimage, a moving meditation where the only sounds were birdsong, rustling leaves, and his own labored breathing. Fall had painted the forest in rust and gold. Thomas walked slower these days, his knees protesting each incline. His doctor had mentioned replacement surgery last year, but Thomas had waved it away. What was the point of new knees when the rest of him was wearing out just fine? He was 2 miles in when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong. Not quite a roar, more like a moan of pain mixed with a warning growl. Thomas had encountered black bears before. They were common enough in these parts. The smart thing would be to turn back. Thomas Miller had stopped doing the smart thing 30 years ago. He followed the sound, moving cautiously through the underbrush. The growling grew louder, punctuated by what sounded almost like whimpers. Then he saw her. The bear was magnificent, a full-grown female American black bear with glossy fur and a distinctive V-shaped brown patch on her chest. She would have been over 300 pounds at her healthiest, but even from a distance Thomas could see she was in distress. Her left front paw was caught in a vicious steel trap, the kind that had been illegal in Minnesota for decades. Blood darkened the leaves beneath her. What froze Thomas in place weren't the bear's massive claws or powerful jaws. It was the 3 tiny cubs huddled against her side. No bigger than house cats, their eyes barely open, they pawed at their mother's fur, confused by her distress. One made a pitiful mewling sound that cut straight through Thomas's chest. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. The mother bear's head snapped up, her dark eyes finding his. Thomas had encountered enough wildlife to know he should back away slowly, but something in those eyes held him. There was pain, fear, and something else. Something that reminded him of Sarah in her final days. A desperate plea for help, not for herself, but for those who depended on her. 30 years of guilt and penance crystallized into a single moment of clarity. Here was a chance, perhaps his last, to save a family instead of destroying one. Thomas slowly reached for his phone. His hands trembled as he dialed Emily's number. 4 rings, then her clipped, professional tone. "Dad? Is everything okay? You never call this time of day." "Emily, I need your help," Thomas said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I've found an injured animal in the forest, a bear with cubs. She's caught in a trap, losing blood." Silence, then confusion. "Dad, what are you talking about? A bear? Are you somewhere safe?" "She's dying, Emily. She has 3 cubs. I need advice on how to stop the bleeding, what to use on the wound." "Dad," her voice turned sharp, annoyed. "I treat humans, not animals. I have surgery in 30 minutes. Call animal control or a vet clinic if you want to save wild animals." "But Emily..." "Dad, I really have to go, and honestly, be careful. Wild animals carry diseases. Don't get close to them." The call ended. Thomas stared at the phone, a familiar disappointment settling in his chest. He tried Jason next, but his son's response was equally dismissive. "Dad, are you drinking again?" The accusation stung worse than any physical pain. "You promised at Mom's funeral you'd stop." "Jason, I haven't had a drink in 5 years. The money isn't for me. There's a family in trouble." "What family?" "Dad, I'm 38 years old. I'm not a child who believes your stories anymore." "What do you need money for? Booze?" "Debts to some questionable people?" "Jason, I'm not lying. I really need help." "Dad, I have 2 kids of my own. Just bought a house with a mortgage. Every penny counts. Stop trying to manipulate me. If you want a drink, that's your business, but don't drag me into it." "Son, please. I'm at work. Don't call with requests like this again." Another call ended. Thomas slowly pocketed his phone. His hands shook not from cold, but from humiliation. His own children thought him a liar and a drunk, and they had every right to. For too many years he had indeed drowned his guilt in whiskey, trying to numb the pain from that long-ago tragedy. But they didn't know why he drank, and now, when he was trying to do something right, they didn't believe him. "Looks like it's just us," he said to the bear. She twitched her ear, blood continuing to seep from her trapped paw. Time was running out. Thomas made his decision. If his children wouldn't help, if the authorities would likely euthanize the bear and separate the cubs, then he would have to save them himself, even if it cost him everything. Thomas knew he couldn't move the injured bear alone. 300 pounds of wounded predator, even one weakened by blood loss, was beyond his strength. He needed to improvise. Using his pocket knife, he cut several sturdy branches and wove them together with his belt and shoelaces to create a makeshift travois. He removed his flannel overshirt and laid it across the frame. The mother bear watched him work, her eyes never leaving his movements, but she made no attempt to attack. Perhaps she was too weak, or perhaps she sensed his intentions. "I'm going to try to help you," Thomas said softly, approaching with caution, "but you need to work with me here." He'd expected resistance when he finally approached the trap. Instead, the bear remained eerily still, only growling low when he got too close to her cubs. The trap itself was barbaric, an illegal design with serrated teeth that had sliced deep into muscle and possibly bone. It would take tools to remove it properly, and Thomas didn't have them here. "We need to get you home first," he murmured. With painful slowness, Thomas managed to position the travois beside the bear. The real challenge came in coaxing her onto it. Each movement clearly caused her agony, but somehow, whether through animal intuition or desperate trust, she understood enough to drag herself onto the makeshift stretcher. The cubs, responding to their mother's movements, crawled alongside her. The journey back took over an hour. Every 100 yards Thomas had to stop, his 72-year-old body screaming in protest. Sweat soaked through his undershirt despite the cool autumn air. Twice his chest tightened alarmingly, and he wondered if this would be how he'd die, hauling a wounded bear through the forest. The ultimate foolish end to a regret-filled life. As he approached his property line, he saw Martha standing on his porch. Her hand flew to her mouth when she realized what he was pulling. "Thomas Miller, have you completely lost your mind?" she exclaimed, but she was already moving toward him, holding the gate open. "Probably," Thomas wheezed. "Need to get to the shed." Martha, bless her practical soul, asked no further questions. Instead, she helped guide the travois through the yard to the large shed where Thomas once kept his carpentry tools before arthritis forced his retirement. "What happened?" she asked once they'd managed to get the bear and cubs settled on a pile of old moving blankets. "Someone's using illegal traps in the forest. Found her caught, bleeding out." Thomas sank onto an old stool, trying to catch his breath. Cubs would have died too. Martha assessed the situation with the calm efficiency of a former ER nurse. "That trap needs to come off. I'll get my first aid kit." "You have any antibiotics left from your tooth infection?" An hour later, they'd managed to pry open the trap using Thomas's old tools. The bear had snarled and snapped when the jaws finally released, the sudden relief of pressure bringing fresh pain. But she hadn't attacked. Martha had cleaned the wound as best she could and administered a careful dose of antibiotics crushed into honey water, which the bear lapped up thirstily. "The cubs need feeding," Martha observed. "They're too young to be without milk. Can you go to the store? Get some of that formula they use for orphaned wildlife?" Thomas asked, reaching for his wallet. "I've got cash." Martha waved him off. "I'll be back in 30 minutes. Keep the door closed. And Thomas, this is either the craziest or the kindest thing you've ever done." While she was gone, Thomas sat on the floor of the shed watching the bear family. The mother's breathing had steadied, though her eyes remained alert, tracking his every move. The cubs had nestled against her side, occasionally making pitiful mewling sounds. "You've got beautiful babies," Thomas said softly. "We'll get you fixed up, then back to the forest when you're strong enough." The bear's dark eyes seemed to study him, filled with an intelligence he hadn't expected. One of the cubs, the smallest, rolled away from its mother and toward Thomas. Without thinking, he gently nudged it back toward the safety of its mother's side. That was when it happened. Instead of growling a warning, the mother bear simply watched, allowing this human to touch her cub. Something passed between them in that moment, a fragile trust born of desperation and shared vulnerability. Martha returned with formula, bottles, and a surprising amount of veterinary supplies. "Called in a favor with Dr. Reynolds at the animal clinic," she explained. "Told him it was for an injured fawn. He'd have to report a bear." As Thomas carefully fed the first cub with a small bottle, Martha sat beside him on an upturned crate. "You know what you're getting into, right?" she asked quietly. "If Fish and Wildlife find out, there'll be fines. They might even take your property." "I know. The cubs will grow. Black bears can reach 600 pounds. They're wild animals, Thomas." "I know that too," Martha sighed, watching him tenderly feed the tiny creature. "It's been a long time since I've seen you care about anything this much." Thomas didn't respond immediately. The cub suckled eagerly at the bottle, its tiny paws pressing against his weathered hand. "Maybe I've been dead too long," he finally said. "Maybe it's time to feel something again, even if it's just for a while." Martha's hand came to rest on his shoulder. "Sarah would be proud." The sun was setting when they heard the vehicles approaching. Thomas peered through the shed window to see two black SUVs with tinted windows pulling into his driveway. Men in expensive suits emerged, scanning the property with calculating eyes. "Who the hell is that?" Martha whispered. Thomas recognized the leader immediately, Alexander Pierce, the wealthy developer who had been buying up properties throughout Oakwood County for his eco-resort project. Pierce had approached Thomas twice before with offers for his land. Each time, Thomas had refused. "Trouble," he answered grimly. "Stay here with them. I'll handle this." As Thomas stepped out to meet the unwelcome visitors, he had no way of knowing this confrontation would eventually force him to face the very past he'd spent 30 years running from, or that the bear whose life he'd just saved would soon return the favor in ways he could never imagine. Alexander Pierce stood on Thomas's property like he already owned it. His tailored suit, charcoal gray with a subtle herringbone pattern, probably cost more than Thomas's monthly pension. Two men flanked him, built like linebackers and just as approachable, their eyes hidden behind mirrored sunglasses despite the fading light. "Mr. Miller," Pierce smiled without warmth. "Lovely evening, isn't it?" Thomas positioned himself between the men and the shed. "What do you want, Pierce?" Direct as always. Pierce's smile never wavered. "I thought we might revisit our previous conversation. The offer still stands. In fact, I've authorized an additional 15%. He nodded to one of his men, who produced an envelope from inside his jacket. "Not interested." Thomas didn't reach for the envelope. "Just like I wasn't interested last month or the month before that." Pierce sighed theatrically. "Mr. Miller, I respect your attachment to this property, but surely at your age, you'd prefer the comfort of a nice condo in town. No maintenance, no worries about winter isolation." He gestured around. "This place is falling apart. The roof needs work. The foundation is cracking. One bad storm and—" A low growl emanated from the shed. All three visitors froze. "What was that?" Pierce asked, his voice losing its practiced smoothness. "My dog," Thomas lied. "Gets territorial with strangers." The larger of Pierce's men took a step toward the shed. "Sounds big." He is. Thomas moved to block his path. And he doesn't like company. The man ignored him, continuing toward the shed. He peered through a gap in the wooden boards and jerked back suddenly. "Sir, that's not a dog, that's a goddamn bear." Pierce's expression shifted from disbelief to calculating interest. "A bear? In your shed?" He turned to Thomas. "You're harboring a wild predator on residential property?" "She's injured," Thomas said flatly. "Someone set an illegal trap in the forest. I'm helping her until she heals." "Helping her?" Pierce laughed, a sound like ice cracking. "Mr. Miller, you're breaking at least a dozen wildlife regulations. Black bears are protected in Minnesota. You can't just keep one as a pet." "She's not a pet," Thomas bristled. "She has cubs. They'd die without her." Something flickered in Pierce's eyes, so briefly Thomas almost missed it. "Cubs?" The developer approached the shed cautiously and peered through the gap. The mother bear growled louder, a warning that needed no translation. "Fascinating," Pierce murmured, stepping back. "Did you know that interfering with wildlife carries penalties of up to $25,000 and potential imprisonment? Fish and Wildlife would certainly be interested to hear about this situation." The threat hung in the air between them. "What do you want, Pierce?" Thomas asked again. "The same thing I've always wanted." Pierce gestured expansively. "This property is the final piece I need for the Oakwood Wilderness Resort. My investors are impatient. The plans are drawn. The permits are pending." He lowered his voice. "I'm prepared to be very generous, Mr. Miller. Enough to set you up comfortably for the rest of your life. Enough to leave something substantial for your children." "My children don't need your money." "Everyone needs money," Pierce smiled thinly. "Especially as they age. Medical care isn't cheap and Medicare doesn't cover everything. I understand your daughter is a doctor. Even doctors have student loans. And your son's tech company, well, I hear it's not performing as expected in this quarter." The casual mention of his children sent a chill through Thomas. "You've been researching my family?" "I research all my investments thoroughly." "It's just good business?" Pierce handed the envelope to Thomas, who took it mechanically. "The offer expires in 1 week. After that," he glanced meaningfully at the shed. "Well, those cubs would probably do better in a professional wildlife sanctuary anyway." As Pierce and his men returned to their vehicles, Thomas remained rooted to the spot, the envelope heavy in his hand. Inside, he knew, was a figure that could solve every financial worry he'd ever had. A figure that could repair the roof, pay off his medical bills, maybe even lure his children back for more than obligatory holiday visits. But it would mean abandoning the bears. It would mean running away. Again. "What did they want?" Martha asked when he returned to the shed. "Same as always, to buy me out." Thomas sank onto a wooden crate, suddenly exhausted. "And the bears? They know?" "Pierce threatened to report them if I don't sell." Martha was silent for a long moment, watching the mother bear lick one of her cubs. "What will you do?" Thomas looked at the envelope in his hand, then tore it in half without opening it. "What I should have done 30 years ago. Stand my ground." That night, after Martha had gone home, Thomas sat vigil in the shed. He'd brought a lantern, a thermos of coffee, and the old hunting rifle that had hung above his fireplace since his father had given it to him on his 16th birthday. He didn't expect to use it, hoped he wouldn't have to, but Pierce's veiled threats had left him unsettled. The mother bear watched him from her nest of blankets, her eyes reflecting the lantern light. The cubs had fallen asleep against her side, tiny paws occasionally twitching as they dreamed bear dreams. "You know," Thomas said softly to the bear, "I had kids about the age of your cubs once. Feels like a lifetime ago." He took a sip of coffee. "I wasn't always a good father, worked too much, drank too much for a while, kept too many secrets." The bear's steady gaze seemed almost understanding. There was an accident, Thomas continued, the words coming easier in the darkness, spoken to a creature who couldn't judge him. October 30th, 1993, my birthday. I'd been celebrating with co-workers, had too many drinks. Sarah, my wife, she begged me not to drive, said she'd come get me. Thomas's hands trembled as he poured more coffee. But I was stubborn, proud, said I knew the roads better than she did, so I drove. Fog was thick that night. Visibility was terrible. The memory surfaced with painful clarity. The headlights emerging suddenly from the fog, his delayed reaction, the sickening crunch of metal meeting metal at speed. I hit another car, a family. Mother, father, 2 kids. His voice cracked. I climbed out of my truck, walked to their car. The parents were already gone. The girl, maybe 8 years old, she was still breathing, but barely, called me mister and asked me to help her mommy. Tears flowed freely now, unwitnessed, except by the silent bear. And there was a boy, 5, maybe 6 years old, crying for his parents, blood on his forehead but conscious, scared. Thomas set down his coffee, the bitterness in his mouth not from the drink. I had my phone, started to call 911, but then I thought about jail, about Sarah pregnant with Emily, about losing my job, my license. So I got back in my truck and I drove away. The confession hung in the air of the small shed. The bear continued to watch him, unblinking. By the time someone else found them, hours later, the girl had died too. Only the boy survived. Thomas wiped his eyes with a weathered hand. I've spent 30 years trying to make up for it. Sent money anonymously for the boy's care, got sober, tried to be a better man. But it doesn't erase what I did. He looked directly into the bear's eyes. So you see, I can't run away this time. Not from Pierce, not from whatever comes next. I've been running too long already. The bear shifted slightly, adjusting her position to better accommodate her cubs. One small paw reached out in sleep, touching Thomas's knee where he sat on the floor. He didn't move away. Sarah knew, he whispered. She forgave me. Said God would too, eventually. I'm not so sure about that part. The next morning brought both challenges and unexpected allies. Thomas woke stiff and sore from sleeping upright in the shed. The bear and cubs were awake, the mother looking markedly better after a night's rest and antibiotics. The wound would need ongoing care, but the immediate danger of blood loss had passed. Martha arrived early, carrying grocery bags filled with supplies. "Thought you might need these," she said, unpacking baby bottles, more formula, medical supplies, and, to Thomas's surprise, groceries for him as well. "You didn't have to do all this," he protested weakly. "Shut up and help me feed these babies," Martha replied with affectionate firmness. They settled into a routine of caring for the bears. The mother accepted their presence now, even allowing them to check her wound and change the bandages Martha had fashioned. The cubs grew more adventurous, exploring the confines of the shed when not nursing or sleeping. Thomas named them in his mind, though he never spoke the names aloud. The largest cub, bold and assertive, he called Scout. The middle one, always curious about tools and objects, became Tinker, and the smallest, the one who often sought Thomas's touch, he thought of as Spirit. On the 3rd day, word spread through Oakwood about Thomas Miller's unusual house guests. Some neighbors brought offerings, fish from a recent catch, honey from local hives, even a veterinary medicine book from the retired Dr. Williams. Others were less supportive. "You can't keep wild animals, Tom," said Sheriff Daniels, standing awkwardly on the porch. "I've got complaints. She's injured, Jim. Cubs are too young to survive without her. Once she's healed, they go back to the forest. It's not that simple." The sheriff removed his hat, running a hand through thinning hair. "Fish and wildlife has regulations. You need permits, facilities. You could get fined, maybe worse." "So fine me." Thomas crossed his arms. But you tell Fish and Wildlife that someone's using illegal bear traps in those woods, type that's been banned for 20 years. That's a felony." Sheriff Daniels sighed. "Look, I've known you 40 years, Tom. I'm not here to cause trouble. But Pierce has connections at the county level. He's pushing for action." "Of course he is." Thomas's jaw tightened. "He wants my land. Just be prepared, okay? I can't hold them off forever." The sheriff's warning proved prophetic. That afternoon, Thomas received a certified letter from the county assessor's office notifying him of irregularities in his property tax payments requiring immediate resolution to the tune of $12,000. "This is ridiculous," Martha said, reading over the notice. "Your taxes have always been current." "It's Pierce," Thomas said grimly. "Pulling strings. What will you do?" Thomas looked toward the shed where the Bear family rested. Fight. But fighting required resources Thomas didn't have. His savings were modest, his pension barely covered his normal expenses, and his home equity was his only significant asset. The next day brought another blow, a notice from the bank about his mortgage, claiming missed payments that Thomas knew he'd made. "They're trying to force you out," Martha observed as Thomas made yet another frustrating phone call to the bank's customer service. "It won't work," Thomas said, hanging up after being transferred for the 4th time without resolution. "I've got the canceled checks to prove I paid." "But how long can you fight the system? These people have lawyers, connections." Before Thomas could answer, a car pulled into his driveway, a sleek silver Audi he didn't recognize. To his astonishment, Emily stepped out, looking tired and irritated in her rumpled scrubs. "Emily?" Thomas moved to the porch, stunned by his daughter's unexpected appearance. "What are you doing here?" "Apparently saving you from yourself," she said tersely. "Martha called me, said you were keeping bears in your shed and fighting with some developer. Have you completely lost your mind?" Thomas glanced at Martha, who shrugged unapologetically. "You need help, Thomas." "More than I can give." Emily followed her father's gaze. "Don't blame Martha. She was right to call me." She ran a hand through her hair. Sarah's gesture, Thomas noted with a pang. "Dad, you can't keep wild animals. It's illegal, dangerous, and frankly bizarre." "Come with me," Thomas said quietly, turning toward the shed. "Dad, I don't want to see." "Please, Emily, just look." Reluctantly, his daughter followed him to the shed. Thomas opened the door slowly, allowing Emily's eyes to adjust to the dimmer light inside. The mother bear was awake, alert but calm. The cubs tumbled over each other in play, unaware of the newcomer. Emily's medical training overrode her initial shock. "That wound needs proper treatment," she said, professional instinct taking over as she assessed the bear's injured paw. "The bandaging is amateur at best." "We've done what we can," Thomas replied. "Can't exactly take her to the vet." Emily stepped closer, caution warring with professional curiosity. "And the trap did this?" Thomas nodded. "Illegal type. Serrated edges. Nearly took her paw off. And you just brought her home? Dad, she could have killed you." "She knew I was trying to help." Thomas watched as the smallest cub, Spirit, ventured closer to Emily, curious about the newcomer. "They'd have died without her. Cubs that young can't survive alone." Emily's expression softened almost imperceptibly as she observed the cub's tentative approach. "They're beautiful," she admitted. "But Dad, this isn't sustainable. What's your plan here?" "Heal her. Release them when they're ready." Emily shook her head. "It's not that simple. Black bears need vast territories. The cubs need to learn survival skills from their mother in the wild. And this developer Martha told me about—" "Pierce," Thomas supplied. "Yes, him. He apparently has significant influence locally." "Martha says he's trying to force you to sell." Thomas briefed his daughter on the escalating pressure tactics, the tax reassessment, the mortgage issues, the veiled threats about reporting the bears. Emily listened with growing concern. This is serious, Dad. You could lose everything fighting this battle. Some things are worth fighting for, Thomas said simply. Emily studied her father's face, seeing something there she hadn't noticed in years. Purpose, determination, life. You've changed, she observed, since I saw you last Christmas. You seem more present. Thomas glanced at the Bear family. Maybe I needed reminding that I'm not dead yet. That evening, Emily stayed for dinner, the first time in years she'd done so without holiday obligation. They sat at the kitchen table, the conversation stilted at first, then gradually warming as shared memories of Sarah created neutral ground. Mom would have loved this, you know, Emily said, gesturing toward the shed. The Great Bear Rescue. Thomas smiled faintly. She always had a soft spot for strays. Is that why she kept you around? The joke slipped out before Emily could censor it, a flash of the easy banter they'd once shared. Thomas's surprised laugh seemed to crack something open between them. Probably. Your mother was a saint. She was, Emily agreed, her expression growing serious. Dad, why did you start drinking? Before I was born, I mean. Mom never really explained it. Thomas's hands stilled on his coffee cup. In the shed, he'd confessed to a bear. Could he finally tell his daughter? There was an accident, he began hesitantly. A long time ago. Before he could continue, headlights swept across the kitchen window as a vehicle pulled into the driveway. Thomas rose, peering out cautiously. It's Pierce again, he said, recognizing the black SUV. And he's got company. 2 additional vehicles had arrived, a county sheriff's cruiser, not Sheriff Daniels, and what appeared to be an animal control van. Dad? Emily was beside him now, concern evident. What's happening? They've come for the bears, Thomas said grimly, reaching for his coat. Stay inside. Like hell I will, Emily replied, surprising him with both her language and her solidarity. Together they stepped onto the porch as Pierce and his entourage approached. The developer's smooth facade was firmly in place, but Thomas could see the triumph in his eyes. Mr. Miller? Pierce nodded cordially. I see you have company. Dr. Miller, I presume? I've heard impressive things about your cardiac research. Emily's eyes narrowed at this unexpected familiarity. Who are you? Alexander Pierce. Your father and I have been discussing a business arrangement. He turned to Thomas. I'm afraid time has run out on our negotiation period. These gentlemen are here to address the wildlife situation. A uniformed county officer stepped forward. Thomas Miller, we have reports of endangered wildlife being kept on these premises without proper authorization. We're here to investigate and, if necessary, remove the animals. On whose authority? Thomas demanded. County Wildlife Management, in conjunction with state regulations, the officer replied, sounding rehearsed. Sir, harboring wild predators is a Class C misdemeanor, punishable by— They're injured, Thomas interrupted. The mother was caught in an illegal trap. Taking her cubs now would be a death sentence. That's for the professionals to determine, Pierce interjected smoothly. I'm sure the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center will take excellent care of them. Thomas noticed Pierce hadn't brought his usual security detail. Instead, the animal control officer, a thin man with a permanent scowl, was unloading equipment from the van. Catch poles, tranquilizer guns, transport cages. You can't do this, Thomas said, stepping between them and the shed. Actually, Mr. Miller, Pierce smiled coldly. We can, unless, of course, you'd prefer to revisit our earlier discussion. My offer still stands. For the next 5 minutes. It was blackmail, pure and simple. Sell to Pierce or watch the bears be taken away. Likely separated, possibly euthanized if deemed too dangerous or expensive to rehabilitate. Thomas felt a familiar sensation building in his chest, the tightness that had preceded panic attacks in the years after the accident. But this time, it was different. This wasn't fear or guilt. This was rage, clean, clarifying anger at the injustice before him. "Dad," Emily whispered urgently, "what's going on here? What does he want?" Before Thomas could answer, the shed door creaked. Everyone froze as the mother bear emerged into the twilight, her massive form silhouetted against the shed's interior light. Behind her, the cubs huddled in the doorway, confused by the commotion. The animal control officer fumbled for his tranquilizer gun. The sheriff reached for his sidearm. "Don't!" Thomas moved to stand beside the bear, one hand raised to the humans, the other gently touching the bear's uninjured shoulder. "She's not aggressive. She's protecting her family." The bear didn't growl or charge. She simply stood her ground, eyes fixed on Pierce with an intelligence that seemed to transcend species. Something passed between them. Predator recognizing predator across the divide of evolution. For the first time, Pierce's composure slipped. "Control that animal," he ordered sharply. "She doesn't need controlling," Thomas replied. "She needs protecting. From people like you who see the world as something to be used rather than treasured." As they stood at this impasse, headlights again swept the yard as another vehicle arrived. A large pickup truck pulled in and Sheriff Jim Daniels stepped out, followed by two uniformed fish and wildlife officers. "Evening, folks," Daniels said, his casual tone belied by his watchful eyes. "Heard there might be a situation here." Thomas had never been so glad to see the sheriff in his life. Sheriff Daniels surveyed the tense scene with the practiced calm of a man who'd broken up countless bar fights and domestic disputes over his 30-year career. His gaze moved from Thomas and the bear to Pierce and his cohorts, settling finally on the fish and wildlife officers flanking him. "Officer Ramirez, Officer Chen." He nodded to the wildlife officials. "Appreciate you coming out on short notice." The female officer, Ramirez, stepped forward. "We received conflicting reports about an injured bear being kept on private property." Her tone was professional, but not hostile. Sheriff Daniels suggested we assess the situation personally before taking action. Pierce's smile hardened. "The situation is clear. Mr. Miller is harboring dangerous wildlife without permits or proper facilities. County Ordinance 42B specifically prohibits—" "With all due respect, Mr. Pierce," Officer Chen interrupted, "wildlife management falls under state jurisdiction, not county." He turned to Thomas. "Sir, can you explain the circumstances?" Thomas kept one hand resting gently on the bear's shoulder. "Found her 3 days ago in the forest. Left front paw caught in an illegal trap. 3 cubs too young to survive without her. Brought them here to heal. Planning to release them when they're ready." Ramirez approached cautiously, her experienced eyes assessing the bear. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward the injured paw. To everyone's amazement, the bear allowed the wildlife officer to examine her bandaged limb without aggression. Ramirez's professional demeanor slipped momentarily as she completed her examination. "This is unusual," she admitted. "Bears rarely tolerate human handling, especially with cubs present." She straightened up. "The trap that did this, do you still have it?" Thomas nodded toward the shed. "Inside?" "Wrapped in a tarp." Officer Chen retrieved the trap, his expression darkening as he examined it. "This is a modified conibear with serrated edges, highly illegal. We've found 3 others in the county this month." Pierce shifted uncomfortably. "The legality of the trap is irrelevant to the current situation. Mr. Miller has no facilities or expertise to—" "Actually," Emily stepped forward, "I'm Dr. Emily Miller, cardiothoracic surgeon at Mayo Clinic. I've been monitoring the bear's condition. The wound is healing well, no signs of infection. My father's care has been medically sound, if unconventional." Thomas glanced at his daughter with surprise and gratitude. Officer Ramirez consulted quietly with her colleague, then addressed Thomas. "Mr. Miller, While your intentions appear honorable, there are protocols for wildlife rehabilitation. Normally, we'd be required to remove these animals to a licensed facility. Thomas's heart sank. Despite the more sympathetic approach, the outcome would be the same: the bears taken away, the family separated. However, Ramirez continued, given the unusual circumstances, we might be able to work out an alternative arrangement. What kind of arrangement? Thomas asked cautiously. A temporary special permit for wildlife rehabilitation. You'd need to meet certain requirements: proper enclosure, dietary guidelines, regular veterinary checks, and Officer Chen and I would need to make weekly inspections until the bears are ready for release. Which could be arranged immediately, Pierce interjected smoothly, once Mr. Miller accepts my offer for the property. Sheriff Daniels frowned. Mr. Pierce, this sounds suspiciously like coercion. Pierce adjusted his tie, simply pointing out the practical considerations. Mr. Miller's financial situation is hardly conducive to meeting the standards required for wildlife rehabilitation. Actually, Emily said, her voice steady despite her obvious anger, my father won't be selling, and as for financial considerations, I'll be covering any expenses associated with the bear's care. Thomas stared at his daughter. Emily, you don't have to. I want to, Dad. She met his gaze directly. It's time I started showing up for the things that matter. Pierce's careful composure cracked. This is absurd. That property is essential for the Oakwood Wilderness Resort development. My investors have already committed millions. Your resort will have to work around this plot, Emily replied coolly, or find another location entirely. The county officer, clearly uncomfortable with the turn of events, cleared his throat. Mr. Pierce, without cause for removal of the animals under wildlife regulations, we have no grounds to proceed tonight. Pierce's face flushed with barely contained fury. This isn't over, Miller. His gaze shifted from Thomas to the bear, then to Emily. Not by a long shot. He turned on his heel and stalked back to his vehicle, followed by the county officers. As the unwelcome visitors drove away, the mother bear retreated to the shed, shepherding her cubs before her. The immediate crisis had passed, but Thomas knew it was merely a reprieve, not a resolution. Thank you, he said to Sheriff Daniels and the wildlife officers. I didn't expect. Jim called us directly, Officer Ramirez explained. Said you were a good man in a tough situation. We've been tracking these illegal traps for months. Finding one intact with evidence is actually helpful to our investigation. We'll draw up the paperwork for your temporary rehabilitation permit, Officer Chen added. But the requirements are serious, Mr. Miller. These aren't pets. I understand, Thomas nodded. I never intended to keep them permanently. After the officers departed, Thomas, Emily, and Martha retreated to the kitchen. Thomas's hands shook as he brewed coffee, the adrenaline crash hitting him hard. Emily noticed but said nothing, simply taking over the task without comment. That was quite a performance, Martha observed, settling into a chair at the table. I didn't know you had it in you, Emily. Emily smiled ruefully. Neither did I. She placed a mug of coffee in front of her father. Dad, what Pierce said about your financial situation, is it true? Thomas sighed heavily. Not entirely. I'm not destitute, but I'm not flush either. Pension covers the basics. There have been some unexpected expenses lately. Like the property tax bill and mortgage issues Martha mentioned? Pierce is doing, Thomas confirmed. Pressure tactics. Emily's expression hardened. That's illegal harassment. We can fight it. With what? Pierce has lawyers' connections. So do I. Emily pulled out her phone. I'm calling Jason. Your brother wants nothing to do with this, Thomas warned. He thinks I'm back to drinking. Then it's time he learned otherwise. Emily dialed, putting the call on speaker. Jason answered on the fourth ring, his voice wary. Emily? It's late. Is everything okay? I'm at Dad's. You need to come. What? Why? What's he done now? Emily's voice sharpened. He's stood up to a wealthy developer who's trying to force him off his land. He's rescued a mother bear and cubs from an illegal trap. And he's finally ready to talk about why he started drinking 30 years ago. Silence stretched across the line. Then, "Is he there? Can he hear me?" "I'm here, son," Thomas said quietly. Another pause. "I'll catch the first flight tomorrow." The call ended. Thomas stared at the phone. "He's coming." "Just like that." "Just like that," Emily confirmed, though she looked as surprised as her father. "Dad, what were you going to tell me earlier about the accident?" Thomas's chest tightened. Twice in one day, the opportunity to confess had presented itself. He looked at his daughter, Sarah's eyes in a face that had grown more serious with the years of medical training and practice. He wondered if those eyes would still look at him with anything but disgust once she knew the truth. "It can wait until Jason's here," he said finally. "It's something you both should hear." The following morning brought fresh challenges. Thomas woke to find Martha already in the shed, her expression grave as she examined the mother bear. "She's running a fever," Martha reported. "The wound is infected despite the antibiotics." Thomas knelt beside the bear, who seemed listless, her breathing labored. The cubs sensed their mother's distress, staying unusually close to her side. "We need a vet," Thomas said. "Who's going to treat a wild bear?" Martha asked practically. "Even with the temporary permit, most vets aren't equipped for large predators." As if in answer, a truck pulled into the driveway. Dr. Reynolds from the local animal clinic stepped out carrying a large medical bag. "Sheriff Daniels called," he explained when Thomas met him at the door. "Said you might need some unofficial assistance before the Wildlife Service gets their paperwork in order." For the next hour, Dr. Reynolds worked on the bear, cleaning the wound thoroughly, administering stronger antibiotics, and showing Thomas and Martha how to properly change the dressings. "She's lucky," the vet said, packing up his equipment. "Another day and she might have lost the paw, or worse. I'll come back tomorrow to check on her." By afternoon, the bear's condition had stabilized. Thomas maintained his vigil in the shed, feeding the cubs while their mother rested. He was dozing in his chair when Emily shook him gently. "Dad, Jason's here." Thomas blinked awake, disoriented momentarily. "Already? I thought his flight wasn't until tonight." He caught an earlier connection. "He's waiting in the house." Thomas followed his daughter across the yard, suddenly nervous at the prospect of facing his son. It had been almost a year since they'd seen each other in person, their relationship reduced to brief phone calls and holiday obligations. Jason stood by the fireplace, examining the family photos on the mantel. At 41, he strongly resembled Thomas at that age. Same sturdy build, same stubborn set to the jaw. He turned as Thomas entered. "Dad." "Jason, thanks for coming." An awkward silence descended, neither man quite sure how to bridge the years of distance. Finally, Jason spoke. "Emily said you're keeping bears in the shed?" Despite everything, Thomas smiled. "It's a long story. I've got time." Emily made coffee while Thomas briefed Jason on the events of the past few days. His son listened without interruption, his expression unreadable until Thomas mentioned Pierce's pressure tactics. "Wait, Alexander Pierce? Of Oakwood Developments?" Jason straightened. "Dark hair, about 40, always wears custom suits." "You know him?" Thomas asked, surprised. "Know of him. He tried to buy out a tech startup my company was partnering with last year. When the founders refused, suddenly they had tax audits, building code violations, personal harassment." Jason's expression darkened. "One of the founders committed suicide after Pierce leaked information about his gambling debts to his family." "Jesus," Emily muttered. "Pierce plays dirty," Jason continued, "but he's careful to keep his own hands clean, uses intermediaries, shell companies, plausible deniability." "Can he be stopped?" Thomas asked. "Maybe. With the right evidence and resources." Jason studied his father. "What I don't understand is why you care so much about these bears. Since when are you an animal rights activist?" Thomas met his son's skeptical gaze. "Since I saw myself in that mother's eyes, desperate, willing to do anything to protect her cubs." "And that reminded you of—" Jason prompted. Thomas took a deep breath. The moment had arrived. No more deflections, no more delays. "It reminded me of what I wasn't 30 years ago, what I failed to be." Emily and Jason exchanged glances. "Dad, what are you talking about?" Emily asked gently. Thomas's hands gripped his coffee mug like a lifeline. "October 30th, 1993, my 30th birthday." "The accident," Emily said. "You started to tell me about it yesterday." Thomas nodded. "I was celebrating with co-workers, drinking heavily. Sarah was pregnant with you, Emily. She called, offered to pick me up. I refused." His voice grew hoarse with remembered shame. "Oh, I said I was fine to drive. I wasn't." The kitchen was silent except for the ticking of the old clock on the wall, the one Sarah had insisted on keeping even after it stopped keeping proper time. Thomas forced himself to continue. "Fog was thick that night. I was speeding, music blaring, didn't see the other car until it was too late. They were in the wrong lane, passing someone. I swerved, but—" He swallowed hard. "Their car went off the road, flipped several times." "Dad," Jason's voice had lost its edge. "Accidents happen, even fatal ones. It's what happened next." Thomas couldn't look at his children now. "I got out of my truck, went to their car. The parents were already dead. The little girl, maybe 8, she was still alive, barely, called me mister and asked me to help her mommy." Emily's hand flew to her mouth. "And there was a boy, 5 years old, crying, bleeding from his forehead, but conscious, calling for his parents." Thomas's voice broke. "I started to call 911, had my phone out, started dialing. Then I thought about jail, about your mother pregnant with Emily, about losing everything." The confession hung in the air like smoke. "I got back in my truck and I drove away, left them there. By the time someone else found them hours later, the little girl had died from internal bleeding. Only the boy survived." The silence that followed was deafening. Thomas finally raised his eyes to see his children's reactions. Emily sat perfectly still, tears streaming down her face. Jason had turned away, his shoulders rigid. "I've spent 30 years trying to make up for it," Thomas continued, his voice barely audible. "Sent money anonymously for the boy's care, got sober, tried to be a better man." "But it doesn't erase what you did," Jason said, his back still turned. "No. Nothing does." Jason turned slowly to face his father, his expression a complex mixture of anger, pain, and something else, something that might have been understanding. "Is that why you drank? After the accident?" Thomas nodded. "For 5 years, until your mother gave me an ultimatum. Get sober or lose my family. That finally got through when nothing else did." "Mom knew?" Emily asked, wiping her eyes. "All this time? She knew everything. Forgave me when I couldn't forgive myself." Thomas looked down at his hands, carpenter's hands, aged now but still bearing the calluses of a lifetime of work. "I don't expect either of you to forgive me. I just thought you deserved to know the truth." The three Millers sat in silence, the weight of revelation settling around them. Outside, a steady rain began to fall, pattering against the windows. In the shed, a mother bear fought infection while her cubs slept against her side. And somewhere in Oakwood, Alexander Pierce plotted his next move. None of them could have guessed how their paths would converge, or that the bears Thomas had rescued would soon return the favor in ways no one could have imagined. The rain continued through the night, a steady drumbeat on the roof that seemed to match the tension in the Miller household. Thomas slept fitfully on the couch, having given his bedroom to Emily and the spare room to Jason. His confession had left him hollow, yet somehow lighter, as though a poison had finally been extracted after festering for decades. Morning brought no reprieve from the downpour. Thomas rose early, his joints protesting as he made his way to the shed. The mother bear was awake, her eyes tracking him as he entered. The antibiotics seemed to be working. Her fever had broken during the night, and she appeared more alert. The cubs scrambled toward him, recognizing the human who brought food and comfort. "Morning, girl," Thomas murmured, setting down fresh water and the special formula Dr. Reynolds had provided. "Looking better today." As he tended to the bears, Thomas heard the kitchen door open and close. Moments later, Jason appeared in the shed doorway, watching silently as his father bottle-fed the smallest cub. "They trust you," Jason observed, his voice carefully neutral. "Animals know when someone's trying to help," Thomas replied, not looking up. "Better instincts than people sometimes." Jason stepped inside, maintaining a cautious distance from the mother bear. Emily's still sleeping. She was up late researching wildlife rehabilitation requirements. Thomas nodded but said nothing. The awkwardness between them was palpable, 30 years of estrangement compounded by yesterday's revelation. "I called in some favors," Jason finally said. "Had my company's legal team look into Pierce's development plans and business practices. There's a pattern of environmental violations and permit irregularities. Nothing solid enough for criminal charges, but definitely grounds for delaying his project." Thomas glanced up, surprised. "You're helping?" Jason hesitated. "I'm processing. What you told us yesterday, I don't know how to feel about it yet. But I know Pierce is bad news and these bears don't deserve to be collateral damage in his schemes." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something. Thomas accepted it with a nod. The day progressed with a flurry of activity. Emily made calls to veterinary colleagues, arranging for specialized care and consultation. Jason set up his laptop on the kitchen table, coordinating with his legal team and researching wildlife regulations. Martha arrived mid-morning with groceries and news. "Pierce is in town meeting with county officials," she reported. "Emergency session called this morning. Word is he's pushing for immediate action on your wildlife violation." "He's not wasting any time," Thomas muttered. "We need to move faster," Jason decided, closing his laptop. "I'm going to meet with Sheriff Daniels, see what's happening at the county level. Emily, can you handle things here?" Emily nodded. "Dr. Reynolds is coming at noon to check the bear's wound. Martha and I can manage." "I should go with you," Thomas began, but Jason shook his head. "Better if you stay with the bears. You're the only one they fully trust." As Jason left, Thomas felt a strange mixture of pride and confusion. His children, who had been distant figures in his life for so long, were suddenly fighting alongside him. The irony wasn't lost on him. It had taken a family of bears to begin healing his own fractured family. By afternoon, the rain had intensified, turning the dirt road to Thomas's property into a muddy morass. Dr. Reynolds' truck barely made it up the drive for the bears' checkup. The prognosis was cautiously optimistic. "Infections responding to the antibiotics," the vet confirmed. "Keep her dry, continue the medication, and with luck, she'll make a full recovery." As Reynolds prepared to leave, his cell phone rang. The conversation was brief, his expression darkening as he listened. "That was Jim Daniels," he said after hanging up. "County approved an emergency wildlife removal order. Pierce convinced them the situation poses an imminent public safety risk. They're sending a team tomorrow at dawn." "But the wildlife officers approved the temporary permit," Emily protested. "State versus county jurisdiction," Reynolds explained grimly. "They're exploiting a loophole. Once the bears are removed, they'll sort out the legal details, which could take months. By then, the cubs will be separated from their mother if they survive at all," Thomas said, his voice hollow. Emily placed a hand on her father's shoulder. "We'll figure something out. Jason's working on the legal angle." But when Jason returned 2 hours later, his expression was grim. "Pierce has the county board in his pocket. The removal order stands." "And there's more," He's filed for an emergency demolition permit for your shed, claiming it's structurally unsound and a public hazard." "That's absurd," Thomas sputtered. "I built that shed myself. It's sounder than most new construction." "Doesn't matter," Jason said wearily. He's greased the right palms. Inspection is scheduled for tomorrow afternoon, immediately after the bears are removed. Martha, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. "They can't remove what they can't find." All eyes turned to her. "My husband had a hunting cabin," she continued, "deep in the forest, about 5 miles from here, only accessible by 4-wheel drive or on foot. Harold left it to me, but I haven't been there in years." "You're suggesting we move the bears?" Emily asked incredulously. "Why not? Better than letting Pierce win." Thomas considered the logistics. "The mother can't walk that far, not with her injury." "My truck has a livestock trailer," Dr. Reynolds offered unexpectedly. "I could transport them before dawn, before the county team arrives." The plan quickly took shape. Reynolds would return at 4 a.m. with his trailer. They would sedate the mother bear just enough for safe transport, load the family into the trailer, and take them to Martha's cabin. Thomas would stay with them while Emily and Jason handled the officials who would arrive to find an empty shed. As night fell, the rain turned to a thunderstorm, winds lashing the trees around the property. Thomas sat with the bears, offering what comfort he could as thunder rattled the shed's walls. The cubs huddled against their mother, who remained calm despite the storm's fury. "We're leaving tomorrow," Thomas told her, not caring how foolish it might seem to speak to a wild animal as if she could understand. "Someplace safer, just for a while." The bear regarded him with those intelligent eyes that had captivated him from the beginning. Thomas found himself wondering what she saw when she looked at him. An ally? A strange, hairless creature who brought food? Or something deeper, a kindred spirit who understood what it meant to protect one's family at all costs? Just after midnight, the storm intensified. Wind howled through the trees, and a particularly violent thunderclap shook the ground. Thomas heard a sickening crack, followed by a tremendous crash that seemed to come from the direction of the driveway. He rushed to the shed door and peered out into the darkness. Lightning illuminated the scene in stark, strobing flashes. A massive oak tree had fallen across his driveway, completely blocking access to the property from the main road. In normal circumstances, this would be a serious inconvenience. Tonight, it was a disaster. There would be no way for Reynolds to reach them with his trailer. Thomas sloshed through the downpour to the house, where Emily and Jason were already awake, alerted by the crash. "The oak fell," Thomas reported, dripping on the kitchen floor. "Road's completely blocked. Reynolds won't be able to get through." "Can we clear it?" Jason asked. Thomas shook his head. "Not before morning. That tree's 4 feet in diameter. Would take a professional crew with heavy equipment." "Which means the county team won't be able to get in either," Emily realized. "Not by vehicle," Thomas confirmed, "but they could come on foot. And without Reynolds's trailer, we have no way to move the bears." The siblings exchanged worried glances. "What do we do now?" Emily asked. Before Thomas could answer, headlights appeared through the rain-streaked windows approaching from the forest side of the property, the opposite direction from the blocked driveway. A black SUV carefully navigated the muddy yard and parked near the shed. "Pierce," Thomas growled, reaching for his coat. "How the hell did he get here?" "There must be another access road through the forest," Jason said, grabbing his own jacket. "There isn't," Thomas replied grimly. "At least there shouldn't be." The 3 Millers hurried through the deluge toward the shed, where the SUV's headlights now illuminated the weathered wooden structure. The vehicle's door opened, and a figure stepped out into the storm. It wasn't Pierce. A man in his early 40s, soaked instantly by the downpour, stood in the headlights' glare. His expensive suit was ruined by mud and rain, but he carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to command. When lightning flashed again, Thomas caught a glimpse of his face and felt the world tilt beneath his feet. Though he'd aged 30 years, Thomas would have recognized those eyes anywhere. The same eyes that had looked up at him from a crashed car on a foggy night 3 decades ago, pleading for help that never came. The boy had survived. And he had grown up to become Alexander Pierce. For a moment, time seemed suspended. Rain pounded the earth, thunder rolled across the sky, but Thomas stood frozen, staring at the ghost from his past-made flesh. The resemblance to the boy he'd abandoned that night was unmistakable, despite the 30 years that had passed. The same determined set of the jaw, the same piercing gaze, now hardened by decades of pain and purpose. "Mr. Miller," Pierce said, his voice barely audible above the storm, "I believe we need to talk." "How did you get here?" Jason demanded, stepping protectively in front of his father. "The road is blocked. I know these woods better than you might expect," Pierce replied, his eyes never leaving Thomas's face. "I've been studying this property for years. Every inch, every access point." Emily moved to her father's side, sensing his distress. "Dad? What's going on?" Thomas couldn't speak. The weight of recognition had stolen his voice, his breath. 30 years of anonymous penance, of nightmares, of guilt, and now his reckoning stood before him in the flesh. "Your father hasn't told you?" Pierce's smile held no warmth. "I'm surprised, since he's apparently turned over a new leaf of honesty." "He told us about the accident," Emily said cautiously. "The accident." Pierce repeated the word with quiet contempt. "Is that what he calls it? Driving drunk, hitting our car, then leaving us to die?" Lightning flashed again, illuminating the shocked expressions on Emily's and Jason's faces as they processed Pierce's words. "You're—" Jason began. "The boy," Thomas finally managed, his voice breaking. "The boy in the car." Pierce nodded once, rain streaming down his face. "Alexander Pierce is the name my adoptive father gave me. I was born Alex Reeves. My parents were Michael and Catherine Reeves. My sister was Jennifer. She was 8. His voice remained steady, controlled. "She bled to death while your father ran away." Thomas swayed slightly, and Emily gripped his arm to steady him. "We should continue this inside," she said, doctor's instincts taking over. "Everyone's getting soaked." "I didn't come here to stay dry," Pierce replied. "I came for answers. And justice." "Justice or revenge?" Jason asked quietly. Pierce's gaze flickered to him briefly. "Is there a difference when you've waited 30 years? A low growl emanated from the shed behind them. The mother bear had sensed the tension, the confrontation unfolding near her cubs. Pierce glanced toward the sound, then back at Thomas. "Shall we?" He gestured toward the house. The kitchen felt unnaturally bright after the storm-darkened yard. Thomas sank into a chair at the table, suddenly looking every one of his 72 years. Pierce declined Emily's automatic offer of coffee, remaining standing, still dripping on the linoleum floor. "How long have you known?" Thomas asked, breaking the tense silence. "That you were the driver. About 5 years," Pierce replied. "It took me a long time to piece it together. The police investigation was incomplete. Witnesses mentioned a blue pickup leaving the scene, but there was no follow-up. Small-town policing in the 90s, Jason murmured. "Indeed." Pierce's tone was clinical, detached. "After my adoptive father died, I hired private investigators to reopen the case. They found a repair shop receipt for front-end damage to a blue Ford pickup, dated 2 days after the accident. Registered to Thomas Miller." Thomas closed his eyes briefly. Such a small detail, forgotten in the haze of those days. The truck had been damaged, and he'd had it repaired in the next county over, paying cash and inventing a story about hitting a deer. "When I found the receipt, I looked into you," Pierce continued. "Discovered you lived in this area, had a family, a business, a life. The bitterness in his voice intensified. "While my parents and sister rotted in the ground." "I'm sorry," Thomas said, the words pathetically inadequate. "I've thought about you every day for 30 years. Wondered what happened to you. Tried to help anonymously." "The money?" Pierce's smile was a terrible thing. "Yes, those mysterious deposits to my trust fund. I always wondered who my secret benefactor was." Emily glanced at her father. "You sent him money?" Thomas nodded. "Through a lawyer. Half my income, every month. For education, medical care, whatever he needed." "Blood money," Pierce said flatly. "Did it help you sleep at night, Mr. Miller?" "Nothing helped me sleep at night," Thomas replied honestly. Pierce studied him, searching for deception. "When I discovered who you were, I expected to find a monster. Instead, I found a sad old man living in isolation. It was disappointing." "So you decided to take his land instead?" Jason interjected. "Force him out through your development project?" "The development is real," Pierce countered. "My company has legitimate business interests here. But yes, I specifically targeted this property because of who owned it." His gaze returned to Thomas. "I wanted you to feel helpless, to lose your home, to understand what it's like to have everything taken from you in an instant." Thunder rumbled outside, a distant echo of the storm's fury. Inside, the atmosphere was charged with a different kind of electricity, decades of guilt meeting years of calculated hatred. "What happened that night?" Pierce asked suddenly. "I remember fragments, headlights, the crash, my parents not answering me, Jennifer crying, then going quiet. A man at the window, you, looking in, then leaving." His composure slipped slightly. "I've filled in the blanks 1,000 different ways. I want to hear your version." Thomas took a shuddering breath. "I was drunk, driving too fast. Your father was passing another car on a blind curve. We collided. Your car went off the road. The familiar guilt washed over him anew. I stopped, went to help. Your parents were already gone. Your sister was badly injured. You were conscious, calling for your parents." "And then?" Pierce prompted, his voice tight. "I started to call 911. Had my phone out." Thomas couldn't meet Pierce's eyes. "Then I thought about jail, about my pregnant wife, about losing everything. So I left, got back in my truck and drove away." The kitchen was silent except for the sound of rain against the windows. Even the ancient refrigerator seemed to hold its breath. "Do you know how long it was before someone found us?" Pierce asked quietly. Thomas shook his head. 4 hours. A trucker spotted the wreckage at dawn. Jennifer died somewhere in hour 3, according to the coroner. She might have survived with prompt medical attention. Emily made a small, distressed sound. Jason's face had gone pale. "I was in the hospital for weeks," Pierce continued, his tone oddly conversational now. "Traumatic brain injury, broken arm and collarbone. When I woke up properly, they told me everyone was gone. No other family wanted me. I went into the system." "I'm so sorry," Thomas repeated uselessly. "The Pierces adopted me when I was 7. Good people, wealthy, gave me every advantage." A shadow crossed his face. But nothing replaced what was taken. The conversation paused as a particularly loud crack of thunder shook the house. The lights flickered but stayed on. "Why the bears?" Pierce asked suddenly. "Of all the things to risk everything for, why them?" Thomas considered the question. "When I found her in that trap with her cubs, she was desperate, willing to trust a human because her children's lives depended on it." He met Pierce's gaze directly for the first time. "I saw a chance to not run away, to actually help this time. Something indefinable shifted in Pierce's expression. Redemption through wildlife rescue. Poetic. Not redemption, Thomas shook his head. There's no redemption for what I did, just not making the same mistake twice. Pierce paced the small kitchen, his expensive shoes leaving wet footprints on the linoleum. I came here tonight to confront you, to watch you squirm, to tell you exactly how I plan to destroy what's left of your life. He stopped, looking strangely uncertain. But now that I'm here, it feels hollow. What do you want from me? Thomas asked simply. I wanted you to suffer, Pierce admitted. I spent decades imagining this moment, but seeing you, seeing all this, he gestured vaguely at the modest kitchen, at Emily and Jason standing protectively near their father. It's not what I expected. A crash from outside interrupted them. All four heads turned toward the sound. The bears, Thomas said, rising quickly. They rushed back into the storm to find the shed door swinging open. Inside, the mother bear was agitated, standing protectively over her cubs, growling at something or someone outside the shed's rear wall. Thomas rounded the corner and found two men in rain gear attempting to secure a cage trap near a hole they'd cut in the shed's wooden wall. One held a tranquilizer gun. Pierce Developments was embroidered on their jackets. "Stop!" Thomas shouted over the rain. The men froze, clearly surprised to be discovered. Pierce appeared beside Thomas, his expression darkening as he recognized his employees. "Mr. Pierce!" one of the men called, relief evident in his voice. "We got your message about moving up the timeline. Storm provided good cover, just like you said." Pierce's face went rigid. "I sent no such message." The man with the tranquilizer gun looked confused. "But Mr. Rawlins said—" "Rawlins," Pierce repeated, understanding dawning. "My operations director. Said we needed to get the bears tonight," the first man continued uneasily. "Before the county team arrives. Said you wanted them dealt with permanently." Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rain. They were going to kill them. Inside the shed, the mother bear's growls intensified. One of the cubs, the smallest one, Spirit, had wandered too close to the hole in the wall. The man with the tranquilizer gun raised his weapon. "Lower that gun," Pierce commanded sharply. "Now." The man hesitated, clearly torn between conflicting orders. "But Mr. Rawlins specifically said—" "I don't care what Rawlins said," Pierce snapped. "I'm telling you to stand down." The man slowly lowered the weapon, but his partner seemed less willing to comply. "We have our orders, sir. The bonus was significant." Pierce's expression hardened. "Consider yourselves terminated, effective immediately." "Leave my property, now." "Your property?" The man glanced at Thomas. "Thought the old man still owned this place." "Go," Pierce repeated, his voice leaving no room for argument. "And tell Rawlins I want to see him first thing in the morning." The men exchanged uncertain glances, then retreated to their vehicle parked deeper in the woods. As the sound of their engine faded, Pierce turned to Thomas. "It seems we have a common enemy," he said grimly. "Rawlins has been pushing hard for this development, too hard, apparently." Thomas moved to check on the bears. The mother had calmed somewhat, but remained alert, standing guard over her cubs. The hole in the shed wall would need to be repaired, but for now, they were safe. As Pierce watched Thomas soothe the agitated bear, something changed in his expression, a softening, a recognition of something unexpected. The man he'd hated for 30 years was not the monster he'd constructed in his mind. He was just a flawed human being who had made a terrible choice and who was now, finally, trying to make a different one. 1 year later, autumn had once again painted the forests of Oakwood in gold and crimson. Thomas Miller sat on the newly built observation deck, watching as a black bear and 3 adolescent cubs foraged among the berry bushes in the protected valley below. His fingers traced the smooth wood of his walking stick, a gift from Jason, carved from the oak that had fallen across his driveway during last year's storm. "There they are," Emily said, joining her father on the bench. "Right on schedule." Thomas smiled. "Spirit's getting bolder. Wandered almost to the ridge yesterday." The smallest of the cubs, now nearly grown, had retained his adventurous personality and distinctive white chest patch. Though the bears now lived fully wild in the newly established Oakwood Wildlife Sanctuary, they still occasionally appeared near the observation areas, especially when Thomas was present. The transformation of the property had been remarkable. Thomas's modest homestead now stood at the center of a 500-acre wildlife preserve, complete with research facilities, rehabilitation areas, and carefully designed viewing platforms that allowed visitors to observe native species without disturbing them. "The school groups arrive at 10, Emily reminded him, checking her watch. "Jason's bringing the boys up from the city for the weekend, too." Thomas nodded, pleased. His grandchildren, Jason's 2 boys, had become regular visitors since the sanctuary opened, their initial shyness around their grandfather giving way to enthusiastic curiosity about the wildlife and his stories. Emily had relocated her practice to the nearby regional hospital, moving into Martha's guest house while her own cabin was being built on the sanctuary's edge. Martha appeared on the trail below, leading a small group of volunteers carrying equipment. At 78, she showed no signs of slowing down, having appointed herself unofficial historian and tour guide of the sanctuary. The retired doctor waved up at them before directing her team toward the new rehabilitation center being constructed in the eastern section of the property. "Pierce's team finished the foundation yesterday," Emily commented, following Thomas's gaze. "Ahead of schedule." The name no longer sent a chill through Thomas. Alexander Pierce had undergone a transformation almost as dramatic as the land itself. The confrontation that stormy night had broken something open between them, not forgiveness exactly, but a recognition of shared humanity that neither had expected. The following morning, Pierce had fired his operations director, Rollins, after discovering the man had been cutting corners on environmental regulations and attempting to expedite the development through illegal means. The county officials, suddenly facing scrutiny from state authorities, had quickly withdrawn their emergency removal order for the bears. What happened next had surprised everyone. Instead of continuing to fight for the development, Pierce had proposed an alternative, transforming Thomas's property and the surrounding forest into a wildlife sanctuary and research center. Pierce Developments would fund it as a tax-deductible conservation initiative, and Thomas could live out his days on the land he loved while helping manage the sanctuary. "You're thinking about him again," Emily observed, recognizing her father's expression. Thomas nodded. "Hard not to. Still can't quite believe how things turned out." Their unlikely partnership remained complex. Pierce visited the sanctuary regularly, taking a hands-on role in its development while maintaining a careful distance in his personal interactions with Thomas. They worked together but rarely spoke of the past. The weight of history between them was too heavy for casual conversation, yet too important to dismiss. "Dad!" Jason's voice called from the parking area. "Look who I found wandering around the visitor center." Thomas turned to see his son approaching, accompanied by his grandsons, and to his surprise, Alexander Pierce. The developer was dressed casually today, in jeans and a flannel shirt that would have looked at home on Thomas himself, a far cry from the immaculate suits he typically wore. "Thought I'd check on the rehabilitation center progress," Pierce explained as he reached them, nodding a greeting to Emily. The contractor mentioned some changes to the drainage system. "Martha's team is down there now," Thomas replied, rising to shake Pierce's hand, a formality they maintained despite their frequent interaction. Pierce's gaze shifted to the valley below, where the mother bear and cubs were still visible. "They've adapted well to freedom," he observed quietly. "Freedom with boundaries," Thomas corrected. "Best of both worlds." Something unspoken passed between the two men, an understanding that extended beyond the bears to their own unlikely relationship, neither fully free of the past, yet no longer bound by its heaviest chains. Jason's boys rushed forward, eager to tell their grandfather about school and soccer and the fox they'd spotted on the drive up. Thomas listened attentively, one eye still on the bears below. The mother had noticed the humans on the observation deck and was watching them with that same intelligent gaze that had captured Thomas's heart a year ago. "Grandpa, is that really the same bear you saved?" 10-year-old Michael asked excitedly. "It sure is," Thomas confirmed. "See that V-shaped patch on her chest? That's how we know it's her." "And you really carried her all the way from the forest?" 8-year-old David added, eyes wide. Thomas chuckled. "Well, not exactly. I had help." His gaze met Pierce's briefly. "Sometimes the most unlikely people come together to save something important." Pierce looked away first, uncomfortable with the parallel. "The research team reports she's established one of the largest territories of any female black bear in the region," he said, reverting to facts and figures. "The cubs should disperse next spring." "Except Spirit," Thomas predicted. "That one will stick close." As if hearing his name, the smallest of the cubs looked up toward the observation deck. For a moment it seemed to Thomas that the young bear recognized him, acknowledged him. Then the cub returned to foraging, following his mother deeper into the protected forest. Later that evening, as the family gathered for dinner in Thomas's renovated home, the conversation flowed more easily than it had in decades. Emily shared stories from the hospital, Jason discussed his latest business ventures, and the boys regaled everyone with their wildlife sightings. Pierce had declined the invitation to join them, as he always did. Some boundaries remained uncrossed. After dinner, Thomas stepped onto the porch alone, gazing at the stars appearing above the sanctuary that had become his legacy. Sarah's photograph still held the place of honor on his mantel, but tonight, for the first time in years, he hadn't felt the need to set out 2 coffee cups at breakfast. "We did good, Sarah," he whispered to the night sky. "Not what we planned, but good, all the same." From the distant forest came the low, rumbling call of a mother bear, echoing across the valley like an answer. Thomas Miller's journey reminds us that it's never too late for second chances. At 72, after decades of carrying the burden of a terrible mistake, Thomas found redemption not through forgiveness, but through the courage to finally stand his ground and protect what was vulnerable. Many of us carry regrets from our past, relationships we damaged, opportunities we missed, or mistakes we made when we were younger and less wise. But Thomas shows us that our legacy isn't written until our final chapter. His transformation from a broken, isolated man to the heart of a healing community, reconnecting with his children, forging an unlikely peace with the person he'd wronged, and creating a sanctuary that would outlive him, proves that our third act can be our most meaningful. The bears that Thomas saved ultimately saved him too, giving him purpose when he thought his life was over. What burden have you been carrying that might be released through an act of courage or compassion? What legacy do you hope to leave for your children and grandchildren? Share your reflections below. Your story might be the sanctuary someone else needs to find their way home.